My name is Christy, and this happened in 2003. I was 24 years old, and had just begun working as an activities director at a small assisted living facility. If you're unfamiliar as to what an activity director does, I was put in charge of the residents' day-to-day goings-on, and also to bring a little fun to their lives by booking entertainment and arranging outings. This was great, as it allowed me to be in contact with all residents. The facility I worked in was divided into 3 buildings, or cottages as we called them. The first cottage would have been total assist residents. The second cottage, those who were in the earliest stages of dementia and Alzheimer's, while the third was mostly comprised of cognitive elderly folk, who were there for rehabilitation after a bad fall or surgery. I had been on the job less than 1 month when a new resident arrived. We'll call her Lena. Lena had gone in for routine hip replacement surgery, but was met with a few complications, so was sent to us for more one-on-one care during her recovery. Technically, she should have been checked into our third cottage, as she was entirely coherent. But there was no space for her there, so she ended up moving to the second. As I was also a certified nurse's aide, I would be asked to cover the occasional shift should someone call in sick. At the time of Lena's arrival, we had a few employees abruptly walk out, leaving the facility short-staffed, which meant I had to end up covering a lot of shifts. The day of Lena's arrival, I had just started a week of 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. night shifts. On making my evening rounds, I lightly tapped on Lena's door as I pushed it open and entered. Immediately, I was hit with a sense of dread. Her room was significantly colder than the rest of the cottage, and very dark. Yes, this was evening time, and I do understand how daylight works, but this was a dark that both of her lamps struggled to penetrate. An unnatural, seemingly thick darkness. It felt as if I were being watched from every corner of the room, though no one was there. Trying my best to act as if nothing was wrong, I introduced myself as I reached out to shake her hand. Looking up at me with soft brown eyes, the first thing that struck me was Lena was incredibly beautiful. Despite being in her early 80s, with her naturally black Filipino hair, she showed very little age, and her skin remained soft, golden, and youthful in appearance. Truthfully, I would have thought her about 65 years old at the absolute most. We chatted briefly about things she may or may not need, and I ensured that she was settled and content before making my exit. Apart from being mildly restless and dealing with some pain and discomfort, Lena's first couple of nights with us went very well. However, that would quickly change. I came in on my third night to find that Lena had fallen while attempting to get out of bed on her own, and I was just returning from a checkup with our local hospital. While she was being transported back to her room, she was very irritated, which wasn't like her at all. I took into consideration her ordeal and figured that she would soon settle and that things would get back to normal. But they did not. Most of that night involved me answering Lena's buzzer for various different reasons. She complained of pain, which was natural and expected, and I, of course, did everything I knew to make her more comfortable. However, she also complained of noises in her room and a loud talking preventing her from resting. I assured her that there was no one talking, as I was the only employee in the cottage at the time, and the other residents were long sleeping. Regarding the noises in her room, I heard nothing in the time that I was there with her, so offered up no explanation. Lena's situation did not improve. Over my remaining shift that week, she progressively declined to the point of refusing to eat, refusing to get out of bed for her therapy, and becoming violent with the staff. She had struck 2 aides in the face and miraculously kicked a third using the leg with the injured hip. I found myself spending more time in her room than with any other resident. As I tried to figure out what might be causing her such distress. In the brief moment she would sleep, it seemed as if she were having nightmares, as she would call out and say things in her native tongue, which I did not understand. When I asked her about her dreams, she would tell me she had never slept at all, and was able to relay things I had been doing during that time, such as folding towels or prepping the medicine cart. It was during one of my stints in her room that I first heard the noises she had complained of. At first, I thought it might be coming from the adjoining room, but dismissed that idea when the odd thumpings and bangs from inside the walls travelled around the entire room, as if to circle her bed. I was definitely set on edge, but tried to rationalize that it could be a squirrel or possibly a raccoon that was causing the commotion. I was granted 3 days off to recover from my week of nights, and I was happy for them. Upon my return to normal duties as an activities director, I learned that Lena's family had been called in over my days off, as she was completely uncooperative and declining fast. Her son, who lived locally, decided to visit daily in an attempt to comfort his mother, but wasn't having much luck. He asked me if I could try and entice her with the prospect of joining our knitting club, as she loved to knit and had done so for most of her life. I, of course, told him that I would. The moment I entered Lena's room, the hair on my arms and neck stood up. It was positively frigid in there, and the atmosphere was heavy and dark. There was an unseen presence in the room that filled me with the most intense fear I had ever felt in my life. The now frail woman was partially propped up in her bed and looked nothing like the woman I had left the 3 days prior. Lena was, for lack of a better description, withered, unbelievably thin, and drooping over like a neglected houseplant. Her face was drawn and her lips chapped and cracking. The dried blood dots scattered over her mouth, with the only real colour left in her skin. I asked her son if she had been speaking and responding, to which he told me, no. I understand with the elderly that it doesn't take long for them to slip away. But this was so much worse than I had anticipated. She looked like something had sucked the life right from her body. At that moment, 2 aides entered the room in order to change her linens. Her son and I stepped aside to allow room for the women to complete their task. What happened next still brings me to tears. No sooner had the aide's hands touched Lena's bed than the woman, who just seconds before looked as if she were on death's door, bolted upright from her pillows with her eyes still closed, grabbed the throat of the unsuspecting aide and began to strangle her. The screams that then poured from Lena's lips were inhuman. The frail woman rose to her knees in an attempt to apply more pressure onto the neck of the horrified aide. The second aide and myself made our way towards Lena's hands, while her son hooked his mother's waist with his arm. It took the 3 of us to pry the aide free from Lena's clutches. By this time, the head nurse and the owner of the facility had heard the commotion and made their way to the room. We were all stunned. This tiny woman thrashed about so wildly in her bed that the hospital gown came loose, revealing a shockingly thin body. I could see the outline of every bone that her skeleton was comprised of. Her tissue, thin skin, and just hung there loose and lifeless. It was awful. Her son gasped at the sight of his mother's body, lowering his head and shielding his eyes with his hand. The owner of the facility wrapped his arms over the shoulder of the aide who had been attacked and began to lead her out the room. They had reached the door when the aide yelled out in pain. We turned to look and then watched as she began to shout and reached for her back, that she was being stung or bit, imitating like she would have fire ants in her shirt. The bathroom was right next to Lana's room, and I was directed to assist the aide. So we quickly ducked in there, where I helped in the removal of her top. There were no fire ants, but there were 4 long deep scratches, running from her shoulder down to the small of her back. When she saw the scratches that had formed on her body, she promptly quit her job and walked out of that facility. I would be lying to you at this point if I said I hadn't contemplated quitting myself. Another shrill scream and a loud crash brought my attention back to Lana, poking my head in her room. I saw where her bedside lamp lay smashed on the floor. It was when she began to have some type of seizure. Lana jerked and contorted her body in a way that should have been impossible for a woman of her age. As she flailed about some time, arching her back so high, there appeared to be nothing left on the mattress to support her. A picture was knocked from the wall, sending it smashing to the floor, as well as a couple bottles of perfume on the top of the dresser. Her son and the head nurse struggled to restrain the fragile-looking woman. It was so bizarre to see the strength that she possessed. The remaining aide and myself were instructed to redirect the small crowd of concerned residents that had gathered outside of her room. The head nurse, the facility owner, and her son stayed behind. A few more screams were heard before silence eventually fell. When the trio finally exited sometime later, I learnt from the son that they were calling the family doctor in, and then, more than likely, the rest of the children, as it was looking very bad for Lana. around 30 minutes before I was scheduled to go home. The family doctor confirmed our fears when he told Lana's son she didn't have much time left at all. She had already stopped eating and drinking some days previously, and had basically begun the process of wasting away. Her vitals were poor, and he felt it appropriate the rest of the family be notified. They kept Lena sedated, otherwise she would continue to scream and thrash about. All but one of her 4 children lived within a reasonable distance, so they timed their arrival for their out-of-state siblings' flight in. The doctor met with her children and explained to them that their mother, for all intents and purposes, should be dead, but she wasn't. He had no medical explanation for the seizures, as we now call them. However, he felt her newly gained strength was merely an adrenaline rush, none of which we were entirely convinced of. He did, however, feel that she more than likely would be gone by the week's end. Their children took shifts to see their mother was never alone. And after 2 full days of this, our head nurse determined that Lena's time on the earth was very nearly at an end. So the priest was called in to read the woman her last rites. Her children left the room to allow the priest to do his job, as they felt prayer had always been a private matter. It was nearing evening, and I stayed behind in order to make the family more comfortable, serving them tea while they waited in the dining room for the priest to exit. None of Lena's children cried, but rather looked more confused than sad. Their mother had come to this facility a few short weeks ago for routine rehabilitation, but ended up declining rapidly due to unknown circumstances. The priest spent quite some time with Lena before joining her children and myself in the dining room. He sat down and began to tell us how Lena had been speaking with him and how they had a lovely conversation. Everyone was speechless as we listened to him. We all knew it should have been impossible for Lena to speak. She hadn't even been conscious in 48 hours. He then went on to compliment her fluency in Latin and told us of the wonderful memories she shared with him of her time spent in Rome. 3 of the 4 children spoke simultaneously, stating that her mother didn't know Latin, while the 4th child followed up by saying that her mother has never been to Rome, unaware Lena had not come to us due to Alzheimer's. The priest basically took whatever they said in stride, as he seemed willing to pass it off as an odd spell of dementia. I don't know about you, but I don't think people manage to just pick up Latin when they have dementia. He then thanked the family and excused himself. Puzzled glances were shared as the head nurse entered the dining room, preparing for Lana's vital check. Just as she reached the failing woman's bedroom door, from the other side, a wild and wicked, bone-chilling cackle exploded into the silent evening air. Just as quickly as the laughter came, it had ended. The family and the nurse rushed in where Lana was found, turned around in her bed with her head at the foot and her feet on her pillows, and she was promptly pronounced dead. Now this is the part that still 15 years later haunts my dreams. I was asked to assist the night aide and the head nurse in preparing Lena to be picked up by the funeral home. We removed her nightgown and began to sponge her down. When the nurse rolled Lana towards me, she gasped loudly, as she thrust her hand over her mouth in horror. Protruding from Lena's rectum was a crucifix. I kid you not. That was my last night at that particular facility. The events that took place with Lena impacted me deeply, as every word spoken is the truth. My son recently began his journey into the medical field, and I pray he never has to encounter anything like this. I remember as a child, my mother would tell us about creepy and strange experiences she would have in Mexico when she was a little girl. But a story that definitely stuck with me was a story that belonged to my stepdad. Long before my parents even met, my stepdad was previously married to his ex and mother to their baby girl. My stepdad would wake up very early, at about 4 or 5 a.m, to tend to cattle and horses. One morning, as he was getting ready to leave for his work, his ex-wife got up to prepare him breakfast and pack his lunch. Their baby girl named Frances also woke up. She was very much attached to her father, so my dad showered her with attention before putting her down and giving her a kiss as he was getting ready to leave for work. But before he left, he asked his then wife to keep an eye on the baby and make sure the doors were closed and locked after he left. She nodded, but went to lay down with Frances. Eventually the mum fell asleep, but the baby didn't. She was over a year old and managed to get down from the bed and out of the room in search of her father, but didn't find him anywhere. So she walked towards the front door, and obviously the mum forgot to make sure it was locked and secured, and Frances managed to open the front door and walked out of the house. This is where things get really strange. A friend of my dad's recalls hearing what sounded like a child crying. It was so early in the morning and still dark outside. The noise obviously scared him. He grabbed a thick wooden stick and walked closer to investigate the noise, when he saw a little child. As he walked closer, he realized it was a familiar face. It was Frances, walking barefoot, all alone, looking scared and lost. He picked her up and took her to my stepfather's house. He explained how he found her walking alone, crying, near the river they had that separated some of the houses. This is the weird part. The river is long and strong, as well as deep. When my dad's friend had found her, her clothes and hair were dry, and she had no signs of having been in or near the river. But the only way she could have made it across the house would have been by crossing it. The child was very visibly shaken and scared, and wouldn't stop crying, and soon stopped eating after. She developed a high fever, and no doctor could figure out what was causing any of it. One of my dad's friends went to see a witch doctor and asked him to do a reading on the little girl. The witch doctor had told her that Frances had been touched by el espíritu malo, or the evil spirit, and that he would require 6 red altar cloths and a few other ingredients to get started on helping the little girl. My stepdad's ex-wife didn't believe a word of it, as she was a complete skeptic and thought that it was all a bullshit scam, a way to trick them into getting new supplies for himself. He urged them to reconsider, but she ignored it. The witch doctor then told them, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but if you don't bring me her back, along with the list of supplies I gave you, she will pass away at 7. My stepdad tried convincing her to take back the baby and that they would find a way to get all the materials needed to start the healing ritual. But the mother refused. The next day the baby was weaker and still burning up from her fever. And at exactly 7 p.m, Francis passed away. The dad remembered something else which the witch doctor had told them before they left. He remembered him saying, "When the baby dies, flip her over and inspect her back. There you will see the print of the evil spirit." My stepdad recalls picking up his little daughter's lifeless body and turning her over. There he saw a red handprint visible across her back, just as the witch doctor had predicted. To this day, my stepdad believes that whatever was with Frances that night guided or carried her over the river and did something to her that she could not recover from. All I know is that every time I hear this story, my heart aches for this child that was just looking for her father, but ended up finding something far more dark and sinister that early morning. I would like to start by saying that whether you believe in demons or not, I for one can say that I know they are real and most certainly do exist. What I am about to share with you are real events and not fictional. This is why I mention no names including the demon's name. I get chills just recounting these encounters. To preface, I am a 45-year-old gay male. My demonic encounter started when I moved into my first apartment in the summer of 1992. I was 20 at the time. Unfortunately, my demonic encounter lasted for nearly 8 years before I could finally get rid of it for good. I will only cover a few of the most terrifying occurrences that happened over the 8-year period. So, I had moved to Casper, Wyoming, a town about 55 miles from where I graduated from high school that year. A friend of mine turned me on to a cute 2-bedroom apartment on Elm Street. Yes, I did say Elm Street. The apartment was the basement floor of a 2-story house that had been converted into 2 apartments. My friend had recently moved into the main floor apartment and suggested that my then boyfriend at the time and myself take the bottom unit. It was an ideal situation, since we all worked at the same mall at the time. It was around mid-June, and there was no air conditioning in the apartment at the time. So as you can well imagine, it was pretty flipping hot in that apartment. I was in the middle of painting the master bedroom when I decided to take a quick break from the fumes and the heat and headed into the kitchen to get a tall glass of iced tea and have a quick smoke. Now, keep in mind I was the only one in the apartment at the time, as my boyfriend was working. If I recall, it was around 11 p.m, and he didn't get home until about 1 a.m. After I finished my smoke, I headed back to the bedroom to finish painting. As I walked back into the room, every hair on my entire body stood on end. My heart began beating out of my chest as I realized there was something painted on the opposite wall of where I had just been painting. There was no paint spilled on the carpet, and the brush I had been using was right there where I had left it. Heart still pounding, I slowly crept up to the wall. The paint was still wet and slowly dripping down the wall. I gasped in horror as I read what was painted on the wall, and it simply read, "I am here." I bolted the hell out of there and waited until my boyfriend arrived from his job. I was not able to go back into the apartment by myself again. My boyfriend, being a complete skeptic, dismissed it as maybe I had done it by myself without remembering it, or that the upstairs neighbor had snuck in and painted it, even though they were not home at the time that this occurred. So fast forward a few months. We had been gone all day, and it was late when we got home. Having an early day the next day, I headed for the shower while he grabbed himself a beer. As I was showering, I heard the door to the bathroom open and close. I remember smiling to myself, thinking he was going to join me in the shower for some playtime. I was in the middle of rinsing the conditioner out of my hair when I heard the shower curtain slide open. "Decided you want a quickie before bed, eh?" I asked, still rinsing my hair. "Sounds good to me," said a voice that was not my boyfriend's. The voice sounded gravelly and low. About that time, I felt ice-cold hands grab my shoulders from behind, and I spun around in horror, only to discover that I was alone in the shower. I exited the bathroom in such haste, I didn't even bother to grab a towel. Heart pounding and dripping wet, I was now in the front room, panting and trying to catch my breath. My boyfriend shaking uncontrollably and pointing to the bathroom. His eyes were fixated on it as he appeared to be in a state of shock, and with his quivering voice, he managed to say, "I saw it go in there." Fast forward 2 years. We had just moved into another basement apartment. This one was on the other side of town. It was a house that had been transformed into 2 separate units. The owner of the house and his boyfriend lived upstairs and were offering us a killer deal as far as rent was concerned. I think we were only paying $200 a month for the 2-bedroom apartment. We had only lived there about 2 months before the demonic activity started up again. They had old-fashioned swinging doors, like you would find in the old Western saloons, that separated the front room and the kitchen. We had loved the new place for about 2 months, not only because of the great space, but because it came with absolutely no supernatural activity as an included bonus. We were thrilled, thinking that the entity either hadn't followed us or was taking its damn time. But either way, we had truly begun to relax. We were dead wrong though. My boyfriend and I had just finished having amazing sex and were settling down to sleep when the saloon doors between the kitchen and the living room began to swing back and forth with a vengeance. The nightlights in the kitchen and our bedroom went out, leaving us completely in the dark. "Come play with me," a demonic voice called out to my boyfriend from the kitchen. It was so loud that it echoed through the entire apartment. Still shrouded in complete darkness, he and I both shook uncontrollably under the covers. We began to quickly argue over who was going to make a break for the light switch located on the wall by the door. Not knowing what else to do, I yelled for it to leave, in the name of Jesus Christ, and the entity roared incredibly loudly, and you could feel the house shake. We heard the saloon doors fly open, the nightlights came back on, and we were once again alone. For how long, we couldn't say. It took us about 20 minutes alone to just muster up the courage to move. Needless to say, we didn't get any sleep that night and kept the lights on constantly from then on. Fast forward a few weeks. Our company for the evening had just left, and my boyfriend and I had settled into our recliners in the front room to watch a movie and chill for the remainder of the evening. A loud knock on the front door, signaling one of our friends had probably forgotten their car keys or something, caused my boyfriend to pause the movie and head to the door. He stopped short and shot me a concerned look. Puzzled, I asked him if he was going to get the door or not, and then he pointed to the motion sensor camera light. It wasn't on. Opening the door, he visibly shivered, as there was nobody there, and no vehicles in the drive, but our own. As he shut the door, there came a loud crash, and the sound of glass breaking from the kitchen. Walking into the kitchen took me a minute to figure out what had happened. The coffee pot that was tucked into the corner by the sink was now laying in a million pieces under the dining room table. The knocking then started again on the front door. Again, with no light to indicate that someone was actually there. Then the knocking switched to the back door. Actually, it was more like pounding. The pounding was hard and loud, and I was sure the door was going to cave in. The air became thick and heavy, so much so that it was hard to breathe. That was enough for us for the night. My boyfriend and I bolted out of the house and spent the remainder of the night at a local Denny's restaurant drinking coffee, too terrified to return to the house until morning. Now fast forward another couple of years. By this point, we had found a beautiful 2-story home to rent. We loved it because there was a spiral staircase between the 2 floors. The front door led you to the main floor of the home, where the kitchen, dining room, and living rooms were. The back door led you to the basement, where the bedrooms and bathrooms were located. It was a way cute little house. That is, until the entity found us again. I say this because after each move, it seemed like it took a while to either find us or decide that it was going to show up. Anyway, I would usually dream that I was standing in a large room with doors all around me. In the dream, all the doors would all be slamming shut one after another. I ran from the door trying to escape, and as the last one would slam shut, the room would fill with demonic laughter, which is how I knew that it had found us once again. The night after having this dream, my boyfriend and I were downstairs in our bedroom, putting our laundry away when we heard my mother hollering down at us from the top of the stairs to come up and visit with her. We shot one another confused looks, because my mother still lived in my hometown 55 miles away, and never came over without calling first. That, and both the front and back door were locked. Thinking that it might be feasible that she had at one point made a copy of our house key and had come inside. I didn't want to be rude, so I headed upstairs to say hello, with my boyfriend hot on my heels. As I approached the top of the stairs, I could see the front door was still locked and there was no sign of my mother anywhere. The temperature in the living room had dropped drastically, causing me to shiver. As I moved into the living room, my boyfriend walked into the front door, opened it, and confirmed that there was no car or mother in the driveway. That is when we both saw a large black mass make its way slowly across the wall from the kitchen into the dining room. Its slow movement appeared to be deliberate, as if it wanted us to see it. As it moved through the dining room into the front room, my mother's picture flew off the wall, past me, and went straight down into the basement. As the years progressed, so did the entity's activities. It had gotten so bad that even our friends and family refused to come over. They too would see the black mass, witness things moving on their own, and heard disembodied voices calling their names. One morning, I had just arrived home from a 13-hour night shift, and boom! It sounded like a bomb had gone off. The whole house, and I do mean the whole house, began to quake. It only lasted about 10 seconds or so, and I'm not sure if it felt longer than that, but I quickly ran outdoors thinking that maybe a gas main in the neighborhood had exploded, or maybe we had an earthquake. All was calm and still, and no one else seemed to even be aware that something majorly odd had just occurred. As I was on the phone to the police department reporting on what had just happened, my boyfriend and my brother, who had stayed the night in our guest room, came tearing upstairs in a panic. Their faces were pale, and you could see that they were truly horrified. The police assured me that no one else had reported anything, and that maybe it was just the house settling. Yeah, right. My brother said that the house shook so violently, it shook him right out of bed and onto the floor. I knew then that it was the demon, and that it was time to rid ourselves of him once and for all. I called several ministers, priests, and mediums. The mediums were at least somewhat helpful, as the religious men were too afraid to do anything, and simply said a prayer and left. I finally found a minister who specialized in deliverance ministry. She was well versed in dealing with demonic activity and getting rid of it. She was able to ascertain the demon's name, which gave her power over it. She told me that it was not her exorcising the demon, but rather the power and the blood of Christ. I also learnt that the demon was not actually attached to me, but rather my boyfriend. I learnt the reason it always took the demon a while to show back up, especially after I performed the cleansing rituals that I was doing before. That worked up until a point, but my boyfriend was the one who kept opening the door for it to open, so to speak. I was not aware of any of this at the time, but he had not only been dabbling with witchcraft, but he was meeting strange men in graveyards for sex, since the cops heavily patrolled the city parks. As you can imagine, both these revelations were crushing blows and put our relationship seriously in jeopardy, to the point where I couldn't take it anymore, and I broke up with him. The interest in witchcraft was one thing, and I was almost to the point where I could forgive him, but constantly cheating on me made me feel like utter garbage, and realized that the last 8 years had all been a farce, as during the whole time he still had the necessity to see others. Perhaps the demon was attracted to his more darker side, But that's just my assumption, and I will never know. Needless to say, we broke up, and I was finally able to rid myself of the demon. Unfortunately for him, the demon followed him, and his whole life quickly fell apart. He got back into drugs, alcohol, and, a while after, passed away. It was very unexpected, and despite everything he'd done to me, we remained friends over the years, and still would talk over the phone and text. I spoke to him a week before his death, and he had told me that he was still being tormented. I have no idea what actually happened to my ex, as it was all kept very under wraps. I just pray that he is at peace now. When I was 16, I had an experience I will never forget. I am a very skeptical person, even with the experiences I had through life. So even telling this story still makes it seem surreal. There's a bit of background story, but since I don't want to just puke out my life story, let's just say that from a very young age, my life was constantly filled with negativity. And I believe everything that's happened before this experience definitely had something to do with it. I was friends with a group of people who practiced Wicca, and it was something I was interested in, so I learnt a lot from them before this happened. It is a beautiful craft, and so open and welcoming. There were more experienced, as they had a few years' worth of practice before I even entered the picture. Anyway, on Halloween, we went to pay our respects to those who had passed, and so we decided to cast a circle in our local cemetery. The circle was cast by an angel statue that had been built for the children buried in the cemetery. Now normally, the door to the circle is closed, but we left it open to invite any spirits to the offering, food and drink. My friend Kate went off in her own to speak with someone who had just died months before, and my other friend Meg and I stayed in the circle, both silent, as we did our own thing. I was upset, and already at a vulnerable point in my life, as I was dealing with depression from the death of my father. He had committed suicide when I was 6, and I wanted some peace. I wanted to hear from him, and understand how he could leave his family like that. I opened the door even wider. A rush of wind came into the circle and knocked Meg over onto her butt, landing in her black mirror, breaking it, which means bad luck. She was spooked by it, but I didn't experience anything. It was completely quiet. She told me to go to Kate, so I stood up and told her to come back to the circle. She was reluctant, but came back with me. When we were all in the circle, Meg told Kate about what happened, so we started picking up the food and other things in the middle of the circle so we could officially close it. I can't explain to you what it feels like. The best way to describe it is like something is invading your space. It's uncomfortable, and it's almost like it's trying to shove you out of the way and make room. I literally felt like two different people, and the invader was trying to gain control. Meg noticed I looked different and asked if I was okay. I didn't answer her. And then I crouched on the ground, my nails digging in the dirt, and I was swaying back and forth, and before I knew it, I turned away from them, threw my head back, and let out an ear-piercing high-pitched scream that lasted for about a minute. After the scream slowly died off, I started shaking and turned to them, and I remember saying, "Something's wrong." And they grabbed me by the arms and kept me still, and started saying a Wiccan prayer. I tried saying it at first, but I literally growled before I could finish a sentence. I felt like I had no control. I felt hatred and anger, but I kept on trying, and eventually I could say it, and began to feel like a weight had been lifted. We closed the circle, went home, and that was it. We didn't talk about it. I laid in bed thinking I should have never have been in a vulnerable state like that, and that I would be strong. I imagined a white shield surrounding my house and my stealth, and I started working more with energy and stepped away from any type of religion, focusing more on the spiritual. Not because I don't like Wicca. I just knew I had to change. I never told my mum or any of my friends. It was just two of them and me. Was it a demon? Who knows? People think demons are the only things that can possess, but when a spirit has enough energy, there's a whole lot more they can do. So nothing extravagant, no speaking in tongues or throwing people twice my size. Just something that ended quickly, but changed my life and my perspective forever. There was a guy on my shift who got a domestic call on the other side of the county. He responded to the house and found a guy running laps around the yard of the home. The family said in broken English that the guy was possessed, and they had called a witch doctor to help out who was on the way. The crazy guy ran up to the officer and got in his face, so the officer detained him by placing him in handcuffs and laying him down on his back on the porch until he could figure out what was going on. While talking with the family, he noticed that the guy was moving. The heels of his feet were on the ground and his body was flat, but his upper body was 3 inches off the ground, and his hands were still behind his back handcuffed. The dude was levitating. The officer pushed him to the ground, took off the handcuffs, and told the family how they should have him committed, and left. No one ever went to follow up. I hope he got the help he needed. I am a 35-year-old male. I must supply you with a bit of information about me to grasp the horror that seemed specifically designed for me. I am 35 years old. I have 2 daughters, 2 sons, and a lovely wife. I am in the process of finishing my education as an environmental scientist. I wouldn't tell you the following if it weren't important to understanding the implications of the event. My family and I live as minimalists. I raise chickens for eggs and meat. The chickens are free to travel about the 20 acres of pasture available. They are well cared for, and I slaughter them when the time comes. I will not ever enjoy that task, but I kill in a kosher fashion, finding it to be the most merciful way to do the deed. I have an impossibly sharp, concave razor designed specifically for this purpose. The animal is thoroughly bled upside down in an inverted metal cone, attached to the tall stump of a tree behind my house. The cone smugly accommodates the chickens, and they're inexplicably calm when they're in there upside down. The blood goes into the ground where I strongly feel it belongs. I don't trust anyone else to do this with the respect that it deserves. I harvest the fallen trees from the 20-acre of forest behind the pasture for the heat of winter. I am also an avid amateur in religious studies. Nobody becomes unprofessionally interested in theology without being convinced that there is more than we can detect in this world. I do not doubt the existence of intelligence beyond the eve of our perception that can claim a form we are permitted to glimpse at times, and at the same time, I do not doubt that there are those which are malevolent. I implore you to suffer this with me. If there were no evil, then good would be a difficult word to define. I cannot overdramatize this, because nothing can save the horror from understatement. I have been meaning to commit this experience to the pen for a long time, as it happens to be the first and only encounter face to face with an intelligence beyond my ability to fully comprehend. As I write this, the following events happened to me just a short while ago, in the winter of 2016. It has been close to a year since it occurred, but I remember every detail vividly, and it is impossible to forget. On a visit to my sister, my wife spotted an intriguing pair of religious books in my sister's bookcase. When my wife mentioned she thought the books looked interesting, my sister offered to let her borrow them. I advised against it, because I recognized these books dealt, specifically, with the darkest kind of occult material. I recognized them as such because I had flipped through several like them in the past, when I was investigating some religious philosophies that were particularly abhorrent. Several weeks went by, and one afternoon I noticed the books laying sideways in front of other books on the shelf. I typically don't keep books laying around like that, because I worry that my children might get a hold of them. I had never encountered anything to confirm my admitted suspicions, but then to confirm my admitted superstitions. But that was about to change. I asked my wife about the books, and she told me that she thought they were ridiculous and refused to read any more of them. I gave her an intrigued, nudging her to go on. She replied with dismissive frustration, "I can't seem to read them. I find myself going over the same sentence or paragraph for a half hour, and still can't follow it." Her voice turned a bit edgy as she continued. "It's as if the script shifts. I can't explain it, but those books just make me anxious." I dropped it when I recognized her efforts to raise the shield of skepticism, and explained I was going to put the books on the top of the printer on my desk, so that I would remember to return them to my sister when I got the chance. At the end of the day, I was coming out of the bathroom and walked by my desk, and I saw the books. Curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back, is a well-used literary phrase that comes to mind. I walked over to the desk, and I flipped the top book open to a random page. The only sentence I read was the most repulsive thing I had ever read. I slammed the book shut and jumped back before I even knew what I was doing. I reacted as if I had just opened a box full of giant black widow spiders swarming to poison me. My physical recoil was instinctively fast. I'm not easily revolted. It was as if what I had read was written to me specifically, and the writer's intention was for me to react in that way. I've read many shocking things before, but I refused to repeat or write what was in that book. I decided shortly after the visit that I would keep it to myself until I die. I'm not trying to be cryptic. I was just so terrified that doing so would bring it back. After I recovered, I committed to making a special trip to return the books the very next day. Little did I know that I should have burnt them immediately. I shook it off, got in bed next to my wife and my youngest child, and quickly fell asleep. I immediately woke up in something close to a dream. I had experienced lucid dreams before, but this was different. My mind had completely convinced me that I was dreaming, but at the same time, it felt more real than a dream. All my senses were all right. I detected everything in vivid detail. I was standing outside the back of my house in the cold. I was completely bundled up in my canvas snowsuit, winter coat, boot and gloves, and I could feel the insulation of my overalls and coat hugging my skin, and tiny pricks of the cold as it clawed at my suit, finding a tiny hole here and there. My breath came out in the thick, swirling clouds that slowly ascended, and I could smell the smoke from the chimney as it drifted down from its 20-foot perch. All around me was deafeningly quiet, save for the echoing rustle of my coat. I was standing in front of one of my firewood racks. The unusual size of the moon above me was astonishing. It was so bright I couldn't see the stars. It painted everything with an iridescent grey glow. Everything was extraordinarily ordinary, save for the fact that I couldn't figure out why I had been brought to this place. I wasn't filled with awe or wonder, but rather confusion ruled in the moment, and I had no control, and it felt as although I had been lured there. But for what purpose? I didn't know. I began this internal dialogue with myself. What are you doing outside? You don't need a cigarette. And it's so cold. I heard my voice in my head, the way I do when I mull over conversations after I have had them. But the voice in my head seemed to have more resonance, as if I was talking to myself in an empty room of my mind. The voice spoke up again in my head, but it was not to me. The voice sounded exactly like me, but it was as if I was giving myself unsolicited advice. The voice said, "You're dreaming. Just lay back and close your eyes. When you wake up, you'll be back in your warm bed." It was awkward trying to lay down. The canvas exterior of my clothes was stiff, and I laid up on the hard frozen ground and looked up into the sky. I observed the suddenly shrinking moon through the hollow center of a large silver circle with an even blacker sky behind it. Strange, I thought. I began to relax and took long breaths through my nose, but the cold burnt my sinuses, and then, as naturally as could be, I gaped my mouth open to breathe. The air no longer felt cold. A warmth spread through my interior as I closed my eyes. Through gaps in my eyelashes, I saw a last bit of frozen breath float away above me just before the darkness was complete, and I lapsed into sleep again. I woke up once again into a state of great lucidity and a sense of complete helplessness. Dread immediately seized power from the confusion that ruled previously, and I was certain that I wasn't alone. I was standing in a room of my house. I recognized the family desk, closet, and general size and shape of the room. But everything was in shambles and covered with a thick layer of ash. The door to the bathroom was missing. Broken hinges were hanging off a shattered frame. Through the portal that is supposed to lead to the bathroom, I observed the naked branches of the old maple trees in the yard glowing in silver light, while their bony digits raked in desolate tapestry of the ash-covered ground at the foot of a pitch-black sky. It gave me the impression I was on an illuminated island in some forsaken void made of dark matter. The wall with the sliding door that led to the back of the house where I had laid down earlier was gone. Dangling bits of drywall and splintered 2x4s framed the opening like broken teeth. I gazed into the moor and witnessed more ashen desolation in the spotlight of an enormous moon floating just above the horizon. Thick motes of dust glittered in the huntress illumination like snowflakes suspended by spiderwebs. Cold clutched me more closely, and I found that I was in my bedclothes. The air was acrid with decay and subtleties of sulphur. The desk was blanketed in the ash that saturated the air. On top of the featureless printer lay the only contrast of colour in the room. The 2 books lay on top where I had left them previously. The dust didn't touch them. They didn't reflect the light, but instead seemed to absorb it like a black hole. Something small with a tiny flashing red light seemed to lay hovering on top of the books. I got closer and saw that it was a black folded cell phone. I found myself involuntarily picking up the phone just to take a closer look. I didn't recognize it as anything I owned, and a light turned on the illuminating LCD display, indicating that it was 3:12 a.m. The phone then vibrated and began ringing. I was not startled. I seemed to be expecting this call. The ringtone was vaguely recognizable as an ancient cell phone version of something from an old-fashioned circus show, but all the notes were disjointed and sloppy. The LCD screen switched from time to a picture, like a picture that you might have assigned to a contact to identify the caller. The portrait was a grotesque visage framed by a misshapen head, and it crowded the screen. The leaned-in posture of the shoulders reminded me of someone getting ready to tell me a secret. It took my eyes a bit to take it all in. The bulbous head seemed far too big for the upper body, as if to accommodate the massive brain. It seemed to stare at me with these huge black elliptical eyes. Looking closer, I saw that the huge eyes were not eyes, but deeply shadowed concavities in the enormous forehead. The head seemed faceless, but then I noticed 2 tiny, luminous orange dots that looked to be narrow chin below the enormous forehead. A jagged toothed grin lay before the dots where the neck should have been. The thing appeared to be nude from the look of the shoulders. The skin was dark purple, and with a sheen that glistened. As if on autopilot, I slowly raised the phone towards my ear and flopped it open with my thumb. As I silently held the phone to my ear, faint and audible screams of men and women in agony could be heard. When I finally greeted the call of the voice, it was slow and monotone. "Daddy can't come to the phone right now." I spoke in the third person, as if I was gossiping about myself to someone. There was a pause and more distant screams before a dry, raspy voice slowly came out onto the receiver, saying, "Send Daddy in." The voice was ghastly. The last word was uttered in 2 syllables, the way somebody might after a taunt, with a slight elevation in the tone of the last. I wanted to pull the phone away, but a warm feeling washed over me. The voice was not my own voice that was speaking in my head. When I felt a grin creeping over my face, a cold rush of terror washed over me like a bucket of water. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at the screen. The purple grotesquerie looked alive. The tiny dots on the chin were now orange diamonds of light that extended beyond the borders of the phone. The grin had become a giant, incomplete circle that somehow extended above the orange eyes and up to the gigantic head. The shoulders had dropped towards me like a bull seeing a red cloth, and I threw the phone out the broken wall behind the desk, and I woke up immediately. I jolted awake in bed next to my wife and son, and I noticed they weren't wearing any clothes. I had been wearing clothes when I went to bed the previous evening. I had the blankets up to my chin as I felt chilly to the bone. I put my hand on my bare chest below the covers, and I felt like an ice cube. These things would prove to be the only tangible evidence I would receive as circumstantial validation for the event. My senses began to return, and I immediately thought, "My God, I need to throw more wood on the stove." My son and I were under the same comforter, and I reached over and touched my son's shoulder. I couldn't sleep anymore, so got dressed and checked the stove. While it had burnt down a little bit, it still radiated ample heat. I threw a few logs in and walked into the room with the desk. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, including the books. I stepped over the sliding glass door to figure out where I had laid it in the first rendezvous. I looked towards the wood pile, and it was standing in front of it. While I was staring at the funneled metal killing cone, I shuddered with revulsion when I realized what the silver circle in that other place was. I was looking at the moon through the hole at the bottom of the cone with my mouth gaping, as if to catch the blood I had spilled there. I immediately grabbed the books and threw them in the stove. I burnt some sage, and my sister was very upset, because apparently the books were very costly and rare. I told her about the encounter, and how panicked I had been, and insisted on repaying her, but she refused. She said she fully understood though, and forgave me. I often think about the exchange with that incomprehensible monstrosity. I've never met a demon I liked, but what would have happened if I hadn't have rejected the offer? I haven't had a visit since then. I was a cop for a few years in the Miami metro area, in my early 20s. About a month after completing my field training program, I got dispatched to an industrial silent alarm call in a pretty rough neighborhood. Alarm calls were pretty routine, but always kept us on our toes, as the suspect could range from faulty wiring to a 6'5" naked dude on PCP, trying to pry some copper. I'm on scene within a couple of minutes of getting the call. Lo and behold, my old field training officer, a sergeant, and her new trainee pull up. By this time, the alarm company had notified the owner, who provided dispatch with a code to enter the side door with an electric keypad. My sergeant had the rookie watch the front of the warehouse, while me and her made entry through that side door. We have our guns and lights out and start sweeping up and down the aisles, which were about 25 feet high and filled with old electronics and furniture, mostly. We can't find any light switches, so we continue sweeping with our lights. Just as we had almost finished clearing out the warehouse, we heard very fast footsteps from the opposite direction. We start jogging our way there, yelling out that police were there and to come out. We come to where we thought we heard the footsteps when my sergeant suddenly spun around. She later said she saw a flash in her peripheral vision and ducked around to the other side of the warehouse shelf. No one was there. We started creeping back out towards where we came from to wait for K9 when we heard a high-pitched giggle from right behind us. Imagine the most stereotypical little girl in a horror movie giggling. We spin around and we both light up a 4-foot little girl with hair down to her butt sprinting down the aisle in the opposite way. She had to have appeared out of thin air, because we were both scared and shit our pants at this point, and our senses were at 110%, and we completely missed her. We naturally holstered our guns and gave chase. Here's the thing, neither of us could catch her. My sergeant wasn't particularly fast, and I wasn't a track star, but both of us were surely capable of catching a small child. Nope. We turn a corner, and she'd be 10 feet further up the aisle than where she was before when she turned the corner. And within 20 seconds, we lost her completely. At that point, we went outside and waited for more units to turn up. The property owner gets there along with 5 other units and a K9, and we re-enter. The owner turns on the lights, and we search the entire place from top to bottom. Nothing is stolen, and the girl cannot be found anywhere. Again, impossible. All the entries were both locked from the inside and padlocked on the outside, and we had officers covering the entire exterior. There's no possible way that a child could have been in there without us finding her. My sergeant was extremely Catholic and swears up and down that it was either a demon or a lost spirit. I think I might have to agree. I am a detention officer at a local jail. We had a guy get brought in at about 2 AM one night, who we immediately knew was about to give us a good old fun time, based on the way he was moving, quickly snapping the back of his head back and forth, looking all over the room. One of my co-workers and I stay with the booking officer to help her out when the shit inevitably hits the fan. The guy keeps rambling on throughout the whole process. Parts of his speech are understandable, but most of it is gibberish. At one point, he looks up at my co-worker and says, "Would you blame me for it?" Trying to keep the guy calm, my co-worker tells him, "Nah man, no one can blame you." For whatever reason, this sets the guy off. He leaps off the bench and we both push him back down. My co-workers are trying to get handcuffs on the other guy's wrist. He was already handcuffed by one hand to the bench, and I'm holding him against his will with every bit of strength. This guy was strong. I swear the bench was about to come off the concrete when he first leapt at us. Once my co-worker got his handcuffs on him, we take a step back, and the guy throws his head back, eyes rolled all the way back, and lets out an inhuman scream that I've only heard in movies about demonic possession. Then he moves his head as if he's looking around the room, but still with his eyes rolled in the back of his head, and spouts off more nonsense. I'm not Catholic, but I was tempted to cross myself. The screaming, head throwing back and eye rolling continued for a 45-minute spout, and every so often he'd come back to reality and talk to us as a normal person for a moment, and then go back into crazy mode. This was a sort of string of several incidents that climaxed in one big thing that got us all sent home for the first day. Firstly, the school I'm referring to is pretty old, built during the British occupation, and actually contained secret exits and stuff. Certain parts of the school were permanently closed, which of course led to rumours among the students. My favourite was that a deformed kid lived in there, forever shunned by the school. Secondly, we all witnessed a shaken, crying janitor being escorted out by some teachers who were trying to calm her down. We were all told she was ill, but the rumour was that she saw something she should have never seen in one of the stairwells near the locked area. Third, the ever-popular toilet, where all the boys went to secretly have a smoke. It was a boys' school. In the same week as the janitor's breakdown, there was a huge gathering at the toilet, and we saw teachers yelling at kids to get back to their classrooms. The toilets were shut down, and the rumour that one of the boys was taking a huge dump. When he came out of his cubicle, he saw several wet long hairs plastered on the wall. Think The Grudge. The grand finale was that someone got possessed. One of the boys went into a frenzy and had to be held down. He was speaking in a very strange dialect that was quite alien in the area, and strangest of all, in an audibly woman's voice. His parents and an ambulance had to be called. Sometime later, we were all told that we could leave for the day. More rumours, as after we left, the school got a priest or medicine man to cleanse the school. No joke. I honestly thought I have no time for the superstitions, but I'm surrounded with them. So it can get interesting. And it got me a day off school. Thanks, creepy demonic entity. We had a neighbour before who was possessed by demons. Apparently, she made a deal with a demon when she was younger, but it followed her. When she got possessed, 4 or 5 men were holding her down, but she trashed them like toys. A pastor was called, as the whole neighbourhood watched, and when the exorcism started, her body twitched and spasmed. She also levitated less than an inch above the bed. The exorcism was very exhausting, and she said that she would just go with them, as in the demons, but they told her to trust in God, because if not, she would be dragged to hell. After the first day, they thought that they had moved all the demons, but some of them were still holding on to her. They did another exorcism, and finally they were all removed. They removed a total of 6 demons within her. And I also saw a news story on TV, where several students in a school in a very rural area were possessed. What's weird about this is they started speaking Latin, German and Greek, languages that are not taught in schools here in Asia, the Philippines. I found it incredibly creepy, and is certainly one of the scariest things I've heard in my life.